Hello, everyone. Welcome to the session 8 of the 2024 Global ESG and Sustainability Lecture Series. Today's lecture will be delivered by Steve Mital and Brian Fox from the University of Oregon. Following the lecture, we will have a panel discussion and a Q&A session. I am Sachini, the moderator for today's session, and I'm also a PhD student at Korea University. The 2024 Global ESG and Sustainability Lecture Series commenced this April, and the past 7 sessions drew audience from various geographies and diverse expertise. You can find more information on our website regarding speakers and the registration. Today's session, led by Brian Fox and Steve Mital from the University of Oregon, will explore energy transition planning for higher education institutions. Expect insights on advancing campus sustainability and building resilient and energy efficient communities. Before we dive into the session, I would like to give you all a brief about our speakers. Steve Mital is the founding director of the University of Oregon Sustainability Office, and as of 2024, he directs the utilities and energy. He has served as a commissioner for Eugene Water and Electric Board, a trustee at Lane Community College, and advises the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. Brian Fox is the Associate Vice President for Budget, Financial Analysis, and Data Analytics at the University of Oregon, overseeing financial planning for the university's $1.5 billion budget and leading data analysis for executive decision making. So at the end of the seminar, we will have a panel discussion and a Q&A session. And I request all of you to actively interact with our speakers and our panelists. With this, I would like to extend a warm welcome to our speakers, Steve Mital and Brian Fox, our panelists and our participants. Without further ado, Steve and Brian, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was a very warm and generous introduction. I really appreciate that. I think that's going to be the highlight of my day, having been introduced like that. Thank you, Sachini, and the APRU team for organizing this and for inviting us to present. We have about 30 slides or so, and we will try to move through them relatively quickly because, as I think most folks know, the Q&A is often the most interesting part. So without any additional ado, we'll just jump right into it. Brian and I are going to co-present as we move through it. Here we go. So today's agenda, we are going to tell you all a little bit about the climate action planning that we have been engaged in at the University of Oregon for some 20 plus years. And here, at least on this side of the Pacific, climate action planning is a term that we use pretty frequently, but it's essentially all about decarbonization. So you could just as easily and synonymously call this a decarbonization planning. So we'll talk a little bit about our current heating system because, as you'll see, that's where our work is largely focused. Some of the options that we investigated, their costs, their emissions reductions, and ultimately the findings and recommendations that we presented to our board just this past March was all around decarbonization. First, just a little bit about the University of Oregon. For those who haven't had the pleasure of coming to our campus, we're in Eugene, Oregon. Oregon is just one state north of California, and we were founded in 1876. There are 7 colleges here at the University of Oregon. I wrote that we have $1 billion operating budget, but I heard Sachini say that it was 1.5. I don't know. It's somewhere between those two. There are about 2,000 teaching and research faculty and about 24,000 students currently attending the University of Oregon. And it's a beautiful place, and we would love to host any and all of you on your trip to Eugene to visit if ever you should decide to come. All right, well, let's jump into the climate action plan, and a little bit of background and context is where we'll start. So pre-CAP, right? Before we actually launched our first climate action plan, we had energy goals. They were driven by the state of Oregon, and they had this thing called the SEED program, State Energy Efficient Design. It was pretty simple. It basically said all public institutions, University of Oregon is a public institution, have to design their buildings to be 20% or more efficient than what state code had required. Okay, so here's a bird's eye view of the University of Oregon. Hopefully you all see my cursor. That picture that I just showed a minute ago, that's the Lillis Business School, and you were looking at it down this quad. So that just gives you a little bit of a sense of the institution. There's about 80 buildings or so, if you added up all of these, about 80 buildings to house those 2,000 faculty and 24,000 students. So from 2000 to 2010, we were operating more or less under the seed program, and these line buildings are those buildings that were sort of built under that scheme. Okay, so in 2011, we launched our very first climate action plan, and the sort of the key feature of it was a thing called the Oregon Model for Sustainable Development, and it was very focused on limiting energy consumption from new buildings, from new construction, and so here were the key features. All new projects had to be certified a minimum of LEED Gold for those spread out across the world. LEED here is largely an American-led certification program for buildings, right? Guarantees a certain level of sustainability that includes energy, but there are other dimensions as well. So, and gold is a fairly high level of certification. So all of our buildings had to achieve LEED Gold. They had to be 35% more energy efficient than state code required. And all new energy use had to be offset through energy reductions from other buildings on campus. So this is basically all these new buildings were going to be erected, but a rising tide would float all ships. Older buildings would be improved as a result. And so this is what that build out looks like across that 10-year horizon. The yellow buildings are those LEED Gold buildings on campus. Some were even platinum. And the forest green were all of those other buildings under point 3 there that we had to go do energy efficiency work in, so that the new load required by the gold colored buildings ultimately didn't add to the total campus load. So that's cap 1, and I'm happy to say, yay, success. Right. So what you see here is you see our energy consumption. The blue is electricity, and this other color here is the natural gas, starting in 2010 and going out to 2020. And the dotted line is rising square footage, right? So what you see is an increase in square footage, but more or less energy consumption is the same at the beginning as it is at the end of that 10-year horizon. But you do see over here, right, it's starting to rise. And so at this point, we have cap 3 in anticipation of new construction essentially taking off at such a point that we couldn't continue that program anymore. And so this is a large part of why we kind of sunsetted cap 2 and are moving sunsetting cap 1 and moving forward with a new climate action plan. Okay, taking a break from that for a moment, we wanted to show you this chart. It's a little complicated. I'll show you pieces of it at a time. That gives you a sense of the energy resources that we rely on here at the University of Oregon and what they're used for. So these colorful ones down here, these are low carbon intensity electricity, right? So hydropower, wind, solar, nuclear. We're blessed here in the northwest part of the United States to have a lot of rain, a lot of big rivers, a lot of dams. And so most of our power in the Northwest is hydropower, which of course is low or no carbon at all. And so here at the University of Oregon, all of the electricity that we purchase from our utility is currently used for lights, plug loads, and our cooling systems. And you can see the emissions are very small, right? And so this gives rise, of course, to our overall strategy as far as decarbonization goes, and that's electrify because of the hydropower and the low carbon associated with it. So what you see here is how we are currently heating our campus, right, with natural gas for building heat. And you can see it's the lion's share of our emissions. And so naturally, this is the area that we are targeting or decided to target in this next round of the climate action plan. At the very top there, just to pull the whole thing, you also see the liquid fossil fuels, jet fuel, gasoline for all of the travel, air travel, commuting as well. And we're deciding not to focus intensively on that at this point in time. Largely what we've been focusing on this last couple of years is this natural gas piece. Okay, so back to that map that I showed you. This is where we left off, right? So you see all this work has been done on the buildings. Given that our focus is moving into Cap 2, our focus has shifted somewhat. And so now we're thinking about the natural gas that we burn in the boilers at our central power station. And that is distributed via steam tunnels underneath campus to more or less those 80 buildings. So that's our focus going forward. I'm just going to show you briefly, give you a sense of what that looks like, and then talk about some of the alternatives or the options that we explored with regard to that. So we have this district heating systems, what we call business as usual. It's comprised of central boilers. This is that building that was circled. This is our power station. My office is up here in that building. And inside the building, there are these two large natural gas-fired boilers. They make 60,000, they can make up to 60,000 pounds of steam each. So those boilers then distribute steam via these tunnels, right? This white pipe down here, that's one of our, that's a return line. I think this one right here is steam going out to campus. The chilled water lines and other utilities are in there as well. So these are about 4 miles of these tunnels underneath campus to deliver all of these utilities. Here is another view of the tunnel, and this right here, this gate, is where the tunnel is entering the basement of a building. In the basement of the buildings, we have these conversion systems, largely converting steam to hot water, and then a hydronic system runs through the building. In most cases, sometimes it's direct steam to steam, but in most of the buildings, it's a steam to hot water exchange system. There's a nicer, kind of more modern looking one that keeps the buildings warm. Okay, and then here it gives you a sense of what we think the cost to manage the current system going forward is, right? So just to walk you, here we are, well, this is done in 2023, so it's a year or so old, and you see that the green is the electricity, the red is the natural gas in dollars, right? The blue is maintenance costs on the system, right? The yellow is debt. And then you can't really see, but there's purple in there, just ever so barely. You see right there the water and sewer for the thing. And so you see these big, these years where the maintenance rises dramatically. That is like the replacement of a large boiler, for example, or some large piece of capital equipment. And so right now that this costs, $18 million a year to operate. This is just the steam system, and we imagine it would rise mostly due to inflation, but to other things as well, up to something like $30 million by 2085. Up here in purple, this is the emissions coming out. Right now, it's about 25,000 tons, and it rises largely due to the growth of campus over time. I think this is where I get to turn it over to Brian. Is that right?
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Steve. All right. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about our process, how we engage with stakeholders, and then we'll start shifting over to what are the different options that we examine. So, Steve, if you want to move to the next slide, just at the very highest level, it was important for us to bring on a set of consultants with technical capabilities for us to examine our current system, identify that are out in the market, building utility grade systems for other institutions of higher education or municipalities, large infrastructure and or large other large infrastructure customers. So that's bringing in external capabilities. And then internally, we have a series of experts, both on Steve's team in the facilities enterprise, my team on the finance side, and then faculty experts with different capabilities, either on the policy and regulatory side or on the architecture and the technical engineering side. Those folks comprised an internal task group whose job it was to examine all this information, put it together, make a recommendation to our president, and to interact with campus constituencies. If you move to the next slide, Steve, we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. So we talked about our membership, and it's important to note that this included members of our board of trustees, so at the most senior level of the institution, as well as faculty, students, and staff, all of the different stakeholders, or many of the different stakeholders from around campus. And we did feel like it was critical that we had senior executives on the team, including board members, so that they had a deep understanding, knowing that eventually the magnitude of investment that we were bringing forward would be questions at the president and board level. But it's very important that the board deeply understand the dynamics, because this is complicated, as you'll see as we continue on the presentation. Again, their job, if you go back just a little bit more, or go back one slide, I just want to note one piece at the bottom. We identified some trade-offs that the group would have to work through around the reduction of greenhouse gases, making sure that we had a resilient heating system to natural disasters, that we manage the disruption to our operations. Remember, we're a campus with 25,000 students that need to be here every day. We have important research going on in our science buildings and our laboratory buildings, that disruption to those would be significantly problematic. And then importantly, that we manage the fiscal impact of this in a way that is affordable. And that was and continues to be a major question. So if you'd move to the next slide, I won't belabor any one of these individual points, but just talk about the calendar overall. This was about a year, maybe a little more, of engagement with a stakeholder group that builds off of years and years worth of work that Steve and his team had done in the precursor to this to build up, so that we had the information, had sensors embedded within our system, so that we could, at a pretty granular level, know what we're working with in order to think about what the next steps may be. Our first things to do in fall of 2022 was to bring on board a consultant team, review the historic work that had been done with the work group, so that we brought them up to speed, and then go out to our campus and actually engage with our students, engage with faculty, engage with our community stakeholders to understand what was important to them, as we brought that back in to weigh the trade-offs as we move farther through the process. And I think that's just important to note, that there are a series of trade-offs that we worked through and continue to work through as a campus. And I'm sure that each of you, as you engage, whether it's at a university or with in other contexts, there are a range of kind of tricky decisions that need to be made about the short, medium, and long term for the institution. After we've been able to go out and get feedback from campus constituents, we brought that back, and then we were able to really begin to dive deeply as our consulting team was coming up to speed on our building and utility systems. We went out to engage market participants to understand the probability of changes in utility prices over time, which is highly specific to the market. And I think that, if there's a couple of things to learn, your utility costs are going to be highly specific to the geographic location that your organization is in, as are your utility systems. Then the costs associated with those are highly specific to the institution and the history and the build out of your campus or facilities. That was our real summer task, was to dive in very deeply into market structures, into our system structures. We brought that back through the fall of 2023 and headed into the winter of 2024 in this kind of 16 to 18 month long process, where we took our findings, went back out to the campus to hear from folks what they thought, as we put more increasingly granular information on the table, give folks sense of it, come back as we formed recommendations and brought those to the president, and the president to the board in March of 2024. So just, 7-8 months ago. Steve, you want to go to the next slide?
All right. Now, so I'll just stop here for a second. I'm just going to walk you through the three main alternatives that we explored and compared to business as usual. So the first, it sort of splits into two options, 2A and 2B, but it's basically an electrode boiler of different sizes, a smaller and a larger one. So very quickly, we threw this in there as an option because at least at that point in time, we thought of this as the least disruptive, right? Because it doesn't require us to swap out our steam-based distribution system. We get to keep that in place. And so we just set these electric boilers down next to those existing gas boilers. and as you recall, run off of hydropower. So estimated annual emissions reduction from business as usual, the 2A was as much as 78%. 2B, the smaller of the two boilers, was about 50% of our load. It would cover about 50% of our load and reduce the emissions by 35%. Although an additional analysis, you'll see where we think that's about 45%. So as I said, pros, it's essentially non-disruptive to the campus. The campus community might not even notice that it happened. Electrifies some 54% in 2B and 95% in 2A. Fits within our existing infrastructure. Some of the cons, though, it just simply adds a lot of cost, about 8 million on the larger boiler, maybe about 4.5 million on the smaller boiler, and we'll get into those details in a moment. All right, option 3, right, is this heat pump chiller. So this is where things kind of got interesting from a technical perspective. If you think back to the slide that I showed you of the tunnel system, right, I pointed out we have a range of pipes down in there. We have a cooling system, set of pipes, and heating system. Those two systems are run entirely independent from each other. They don't touch. The heat pump chiller basically connects those two, right? And so the the cooling that you're doing in the buildings can be captured and repurposed as heat to take care of simultaneous heating and cooling loads that you may have. And so we did a study and we see that we had significant simultaneous heating and cooling. So installing a heat pump chiller connecting those lines increases your efficiency dramatically. So you're no longer setting these two things up as independent systems, but you're linking them. And then so the pros, right, are that it reduces emissions by electrifying some 58% of heating. Very, very efficient use of electricity. The cons, and we'll get into this, requires replacement of steam distribution system with hot water, right? So you can't, when you pull the heat out of buildings to cool them, you can repurpose that heat as a low grade, warm water at like 135, 170 degrees Fahrenheit. You can't get it all the way up to steam temperatures. So we would have to dig an entirely new set of pipes to put those hot water lines in. All right, option 3 and 4, we'll talk about 4 in a second, is I just want to give you a sense of some of the complications. So here is another map of our campus. The color coding is about the 6 different phases that this project would have to take place in because it's such an enormous and disruptive project. So our plant is up here, and so we would go across this major thoroughfare and with water pipes and first do our science complex, and then in the yellow sort of move through different components of or pieces of the institution at an estimated 12-year total. So right, construction requires these 6 phases, each lasting 2 years, and we would primarily direct bury. So it's a long-term and expensive project. This map here, same map, but now we're color coding the buildings according to their difficulty to retrofit, right? So I told you before, some of our buildings are steam to hot water already. There's hydronic systems in the buildings. Those are these green ones. They're relatively simple to connect to a hot water line. But we also have some buildings that are not easy conversions, and some, the red in particular, would require moving people out of those buildings for extended periods of time while we retrofit the buildings. So you get the understanding of the disruption, really, that Brian was referring to earlier. Option 4 builds on option 3. This is a field just adjacent to our plants. Students play ultimate frisbee and soccer and that kind of thing on these fields. I mentioned briefly that we have significant simultaneous heating and cooling loads, but we do have a lot more heatings in the winter and a lot more cooling in the summer. This geo exchange field would allow us to capture all of that cooling in the summer that is producing excess heat that we don't have a use for in the summer. We would essentially go bury it deep, some 1,200 feet beneath this field, and then go get it in the winter time. So it basically builds on option 3, making it that much more efficient than option 3 would have been, right? And so you see the estimated annual emissions reduction is some 76%. but it takes many years to work itself in. So similar pros and cons. It reduces emissions by 86% in total. It's extremely efficient, and then the cons are, again, it's very disruptive to campus. All right, Brian, you're going to talk a little bit about the costs, I think.
Yeah, that's perfect. So we're going to put up a series of slides, and there's going to be some animations in a moment, so hold off for a second. I just want to know if you go to the upper left, this is the business as usual. We've already seen this and kind of at a much larger scale. I don't expect anybody to look at the individual numbers, but it's important as we start thinking about options 2A and 2B, and then options 3 and 4. They have very different cost profiles that impact the institution. And so now we're going to start thinking about some of the trade-offs that these embed. Again, just the color coding. Green is the cost of electricity. Red is the cost of natural gas. Yellow is the debt cost associated with the capital expenditures. And then that blue is operations and maintenance. Important to note on each of these, that blue is roughly the same. There's not a significant difference if we switch over to an electrode steam boiler than if we use a natural gas boiler. So those costs are essentially identical across. But Steve, if you'll hit the next animation. So what we've done here is take point in time in 2028. This would be the first year in which we would install and could have installed an electrode steam boiler. Just pushing that cost across, you see there's an increment there of about $4.5 million. If you do that one more time, that's on a sort of smaller boiler that takes about half of our load. Oh, sorry, that's the large boiler, so there's about $8.5 million worth of incremental cost. If you move forward to 2B, then there's about $4.5 million. And the difference I'm highlighting here is the total resource cost. And you see electricity there in options 2A and 2B, the middle and the right-hand graphics. Natural gas cost has gone, if not to zero, it's significantly shrunk as our total resource use declines. But the cost of electricity increases significantly. And there's just an important point here, at least in our market, electricity versus natural gas. Electricity is about 3 times as expensive on a per MMBTU basis. So on a per heat unit basis, electricity is about 3 times as expensive. In the United States, in the Pacific Northwest where we're at, our electricity is particularly inexpensive, which means that the economics of this are very different in different areas. So it could be even more expensive in other parts of the country or other parts of the world where electricity is more expensive, or it could be relatively less expensive if natural gas or other alternative fuels are more expensive in your area. So those local pricing dynamics will play in significantly depending on where you're at. Steve, if you'll hit the next set. Now, these bottom two are options 3 and options 4. So that's the heat pump chiller, and it is much more expensive. And you'll see the thing that comes in is that yellow debt service because of the total capital cost, and we'll get to those numbers in a minute. But it is hundreds of millions of dollars in order for us to go and direct bury the hot water lines across campus. So the disruption cost and the physical infrastructure costs are significant. If you'll hit the thing, the first year, so this one we're going to compare farther out into the mid-2030s. And the reason being that in this system takes that 12 to 14 or 16 years to fully implement once we make a go decision because of the phasing of implementation. So you don't start realizing savings in terms of greenhouse gas emissions for a decade and a half, or it slowly kind of titrates in over time, but you do begin to realize the cost differences. So you can see the incremental expense difference between the business as usual in the upper left-hand side, and then option 3. If you move to option 4, you'll note it is more expensive because there's more debt service associated with that bore field that Steve was talking about previously. I think if you hit the slide deck one more time, there we go. Back one. Note there that difference, again, it's mostly associated with the debt service. If you look, the cost of electricity, and we'll see this on the next slide, Steve, if you move over. So these different graphs, orange is business as usual. The kind of light blue is option 2A, purple option 2B, the slightly smaller electrode boiler. And then 3 and 4 are the big projects that would include replacing our current steam heating system with a hot water system across campus. And what we've done here is take the total cost, get rid of all the detail underneath, and try and look at those arcs over the long term. And if you'll arrow forward one more time, Steve, you see the debt service that is significantly more expensive. And again, this is the annual expense to the institution, go up out through the 2050s, so about 30 years from now until that debt service rolls off. And then if you'll click one more time, you will see that you begin to realize net savings for as an institution out in the 2060s to 2070s. So in about 40 years from now, once the debt service and the system is fully paid for. And I think this is one of those kind of very interesting learnings for me, is that with these large scale utility systems, there's an incredible upfront cost. You do begin to realize efficiency savings, but it is many, many years down the road. So if you'll move to the next slide, I think we're going to start talking about emissions reductions. Steve, are these yours?
Sure, I'll cover this one real quick, and I'm just noting for time, Brian, we've got maybe 10 minutes left before we want to open it up for a Q&A. So this is comparing the emissions reductions from each of the 4 projects, right? So orange out here, that's business as usual, right? It's rising slightly due to growth of campus. The blue and the purple are the 2 different electrode boilers, right? One getting about twice as much emissions reduction as the other, just because it's a much bigger boiler. And you can see that once we decide to implement that, you get those reductions basically immediately, right? And then option 3 is green, and 4, the whole tamale, right, is the red here. And you can see, as we've said sort of many times and kind of looked at in different ways, these ones get phased in over a 12-year period, right? So we might start roughly in 2027, we wouldn't complete till 2029, but the emissions reductions are significant. I think I just got those 2 backwards. The green is the option 4 that incorporates the geo exchange. So it's very significant emissions reductions, but it takes some 10, 12 years to fully, or excuse me, 12, 14 years to fully implement.
Hey,
I think this is some tables which I think in the interest of time, we won't go through these tables. They're sort of I covered the concept at a high level with the infographic. So in the interest of time, we'll just move on.
Hey,
Go ahead,
Steve,
Brian.
could I say something real quick while we're on this slide
Sure.
that I think is important? The blue and the purple lines with the electrode steam boilers, you can see that very quickly you start to realize significant emission savings. That's true in the Northwest, where we have significant access to significant hydropower, so essentially a carbon-free electricity source. If we were in a place that did not have hydropower, that graph would look very different. It is important on the difference between options 2A and 2B, that electrode boiler, and then 3 and 4, is that electrode boiler is a relatively inefficient way to make heat, right? It's sort of old technology. It is reliable, but it is not a highly efficient way to use electricity, which is and will increasingly be a scarce resource. Options 3 and 4 are much more costly, but they are much, much more efficient ways to use electricity to create heat. And so those are some of those trade-offs that we would need to think about, both for us as a single customer, but then also across an entire economy. All right, this is a wall of numbers, so it's definitely the budget person's slide. So what we've tried here is to break apart the different cost components to the different options at play. You'll see the upper section is around capital costs. So business as usual is on the left-hand side. Then, as is true for the rest of the slide deck, options 2A, 2B, options 3 and 4, which include the hot water system. So we would expect over the next, I believe our time frame was actually a 60-year analysis, that we would have $105 million worth of capital expense just to maintain our current systems over that time frame. If we were to install option 2A or 2B, the electrode steam boilers, the large version of that in 2A, we would expect $179 million or 74 million in incremental capital expense over that time frame. That's all discounted back to 2023 dollars. Option 2B, we would expect $42 million worth of incremental capital expense. When you get to option 3 and option 4, you can see that we would expect just shy of $1.1 billion worth of incremental capital expense over the next 80 years to build out that system, most of which comes in the first few years where we would be installing a new district hot water system. And then option 4 is slightly more expensive at just shy of 1.17 billion dollars. There are some offsetting costs or some offsetting pieces. The Inflation Reduction Act, which was a subsidy approved by the federal government, came in and would provide some incremental benefit to organizations who were investing in decarbonization programs or efficiency improvement programs. And so those are sort of offset count against that cost and would bring down the total cost to the institution. Yes, Steve?
I was just going to throw in that we were doing this work a little early on in the IRA program, that federal program, and so there was a lot of guesswork that got us to 27 million. We do have some analysis that shows that we might have been eligible for as much as 30% of the cost of that system, but we were not prepared to to share that with the board because of the uncertainty. So some of that has been resolved. And honestly, it's all seems to be coming back again with the change of administration. So the IRA has been a sort of a significant issue here in the United States as a thing to move these technologies forward, but it's moving in fits and starts itself.
The next section, and just noting time, I'm going to move really quickly. The next section is around operations and maintenance costs, which includes the cost of purchasing electricity or natural gas, the actual resource to heat with. And you'll note the differences in these lines. Options 2A and 2B at the marginal level are significantly more expensive because the cost of electricity is more expensive than natural gas on an MMBTU basis. Options 3 and options 4, you do see the trade-off, right? You spend a bunch in capital, but you begin to see savings in terms of operating expense. And those are the negative numbers there. The total marginal cost below, and then if you go all the way down to the bottom, you can see the cost per metric ton of carbon reduced. And so this is starting to put that into a metric that folks can understand across different decarbonization projects, ranging from $351 per ton to a high of a high of $1,061 per ton with option 3.
I'll just throw in there also that for folks who aren't accustomed to these numbers and don't know what necessarily to make of them, if you do a voluntary carbon offset program, they are often looking for projects that can offset a ton of emissions at the rate of sometimes as little as $15. Sometimes as higher quality ones might go for $50 or so. There are very, let's say, forward-leaning, forward-thinking states and provinces here in the United States and in Canada. They're pricing it as much as $150. That's kind of on the out end to really encourage a lot of decarbonization. That's just to give you a scale, right? And the cheapest of our projects is coming in 2 to 3 times as high as some of the most aggressive regulatory programs out there. So just to give a sense of scale.
So this, I just want to put those because those are huge numbers looking cumulatively over 80 years. I want to put this into an annual basis. Option 2, we mentioned this earlier, it's about $8 million more expensive on an annual basis. This is the way that we look at it in the budget office. So every year we've got to make the bill. Option 2, about $4 million. 3 and 4, you see the incremental cost, most of that associated with debt service, in the $38 to $39 million a year. Option 4, $42 million a year. If you go to the next slide, Steve, and I think we're back to you on some process.
Yeah. All right. So kind of the human side of things for a moment or two. We've got maybe just 3 slides before we're done with our presentation. So it should be plenty of time for Q&A. There was a really robust engagement with the campus community, right? This is here taking our board member and some expert staff down into the tunnels This is us meeting in the as a task force to kind of go over all kinds of information presented to us by our consultant. We hosted, I don't remember how many off the top of my head, but several meetings with the campus community, open to anybody who wanted to attend. There's Brian there. Some of these were attended by as many as 100, 150 maybe people. There's a couple of them shown. And then again, our members of our task force going down into the tunnels and into the plant to understand what the systems look like that we have in place now. So really a lot of engagement with our campus. This is clearly something that the students in particular, but faculty as well, felt really passionate about, and they showed up in numbers to kind of reinforce that. All right, some key feedback that we got from the campus, and this mostly comes from students, inaction or relying primarily on state or federal regulatory structures for decarbonization were not acceptable. So we told them about those programs. There was a state program that was that we were operating under briefly, but it has actually been suspended by the courts. So students were right; they really wanted to see action. Delivered internally and not just from external pressures. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the campus heating system was of keen interest to students, yet when we explained to them the cost, they were very reluctant to pay for these with student tuition dollars. So that was an interesting insight. And they reminded us acting in a concrete way now and realizing greenhouse gas reductions now was important. And so we read this, by the way, as saying that they preferred to see things that kept us on a 50% reduction path by 2030, because that's largely what scientific consensus is calling for. So that's what that one was all about. Brian mentioned these, but I'll just kind of share these once again. So the task force had these balancing principles that they were agreed to kind of use as best we could in our deliberations and the rendering of our recommendation. So, of course, reduction of greenhouse gas emissions was an important goal. Consideration of the technical feasibility, the resiliency of the system of campus heat production to energy markets and natural hazards out there, the impact on the campus experience for our students and faculty, and then, of course, maintaining appropriate fiscal stewardship. So those were the 5 balancing principles that we were working amongst. And I think, Brian, I'm turning this back to you
Yeah,
to
and
bring
I
it
will
home.
just interest in time, and I think that the slide deck has been made available to folks in advance. So I won't go over each of these other than to say what we did as a work group was identify a series of findings that motivated our final recommendations, and I'll get to the recommendations in a second. And so this really is kind of the crux of the report as we brought together both the technical information, our understanding of energy markets and the energy transitions that are taking place, and the campus-based sort of infrastructure systems and how we thought we should move forward. And that brought us to a recommendation, and I'll talk through that a little bit on the next slide so we can wrap up with about 15 minutes. One is that the university should move ahead with an 8 megawatt electric boiler. It's option 2B. It was actually the least expensive of those options. The rationale behind that is it allowed us to fairly quickly, or it would allow us to fairly quickly reduce our carbon footprint. And that it was really the first in what was likely several meaningful steps over time. And in order to get to those meaningful steps, one is that we should, in launching our Climate Action Plan 3, which runs through Steve's office, evaluate the viability of additional electric or heat storage options, which would allow us to balance the electrical market in a more effective way. And then importantly, to keep our eye out for emerging technologies and importantly, if there are engineers on the call, getting a heat pump technology that will get us up to steam would allow us to avoid some pretty significant capital costs. So there's a huge benefit to that if we can manage some of the efficiency improvements. Just a small editorial note. I think something that really weighed on the work group was, one, the budget component of it, two, the frictions on campus to having the amount of disruption that would be necessary to lay down hot water pipes. And then three, that if we were to make significant investments in legacy technology, which an electrode steam boiler is legacy technology, that we may end up with a lot of stranded assets as we move forward as an institution. So Steve, anything from you before we wrap it up?
No, I would we'll see what the questions bring forth. So yeah, that's our presentation. Thanks so much for giving us a little bit of your time, and happy to spend the balance of the time answering questions and discussing next steps.
Yeah, thank you very much, Steve and Brian, for your talk and insights about the energy transition planning and the challenges in these higher education institutions. Now we will shortly move to the panel discussion session. Allow me to introduce our panel member for today's session. And we have Dr. Fei Mo, who is an associate professor in landscape architecture at Shanghai Jiaotong University. Her research focuses on urban landscape evolution and conservation strategies, with fieldwork spanning in France, Russia, the UK, USA, Ecuador, and China. She serves as the Shanghai Jiaotong University Steering Committee representative for the APRU Sustainable Cities and Landscapes Hub and leads the Urban Landscape Biodiversity Working Group. Now we will get started with the panel discussion. The panel discussion will go for about 10 minutes, and we also request our attendees to put their questions freely to the Q&A box. Brian and Steve, over to you.
Uh, so Steve and Brian, I just express sincere appreciation for your presentation, and it's very interesting. I have several questions, but I would like to leave questions opportunities to our audience. Maybe I would just ask you one question as a panelist. Have you ever considered to use open space in your campus to reduce energy cost or reduce carbon emission as well? Because I just visited your campus in this April when I was invited to the School of the Landscape Department for Helps Conference. It's very beautiful and very green. Generally, the city is very green, and there are a lot of research relevant to how to use campus design to reduce energy, right? Have you ever considered to include that aspect as well? Yeah, that's my question.
I'll take a stab at that. Brian, of course, can weigh in as well. I'd like to, understand a little bit more, Faye, what the ideas that you were considering, if you'd share that with us. But some of the things we have looked at, of course, is solar, using the rooftop space and even other spaces on campus, for solar. We have, you may recall, like we are a tree city and a tree campus as well, and so there are many trees on campus that are placed such to offer shading such that we can reduce the cooling loads in the summertime. So that's one way that in particular that we've thought about using the campus landscape to reduce some of the energy requirements. This we are continuing to look at solar, but in our part of the country, the problem is that we have very, very sunny summers, right? So from June through September, we almost have no rain whatsoever. But for the rest of the year, we have significant amount of cloudy days and rain. And so just when we most need electricity for heating in the winter months, we have the least amount of sun available. And so for that reason, primarily, solar hasn't really been a great solution in what we call the Willamette Valley where we're located. But if there were other technologies you were considering, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, there was one other place that we did consider, and that's if we remember back to one of the slide decks, as we looked at thermal storage, where we actually drill holes and then hold heat in essentially long cylinders underground. That's a place where we're using essentially banked land as an institution that we could install energy infrastructure in. That land, we can put a field back on top of it. It can continue to be sports fields for our students. We could even build buildings on top of it. So these are not mutually exclusive uses.
I think both answers are quite useful, and what I feel is because the evaluation or the measurement to infrastructure of facilities are more direct than open space. So that might be one of the reasons we can see the improvement from energy reduce perspective more obviously if we measure architecture or only measure electronic facilities. So I would also consider how landscape design can be more visible to help reduce carbon cost, etc. Maybe we can give the opportunity to our audience first, and I can share one paper relevant to campus design in the chat board. What do you think? Yeah.
That would be great. If I could just say one other thing about our city and community, it's even though it's a, somewhat of a suburban kind of campus, we we also measure the emissions from our daily commute from those 24,000 students, 2,000 faculty and staff. And about 90% of our students bike to campus, right? Because they essentially live so close and there's really good infrastructure in the city. And about 50% of faculty and staff do. And so for that reason, um, sort of the landscape impacts, the urban design of the surrounding city allow our commute-based emissions to be quite low. And there are campuses across the United States whose commute emissions are, 5 and 10 times as much as ours. So that's a nice benefit of the community that we live in.
Thank you both. Yeah. I think there are two questions in the Q&A section.
I
Maybe
don't
I can
see, how do I get
do
to that?
it.
I'm not sure.
So, while budget is a major constraint for energy transitioning, were there any other major hurdles that your team has encountered? That's the first question. The second one, were there any bottom-up activism as well from the student side during the BAL scenario, asking the university to decarbonize? There are two questions. One asking what are the main challenges, and second, asking if there's any bottom-up activism from student sides. Okay.
Did you say bottom up
Yeah.
okay, just making sure I understood. I understand. Just want to make sure I got the wording right.
Yeah,
Do you want to talk
Q&A.
about that one, Steve, and then I can talk about the kind of non-budget frictions to the project?
Sure. So yeah, this is the University of Oregon is sort of widely known as a place that attracts students and faculty with strong environmental passions. That's why we end up actually by being one of the institutions in this country that's going first with regard to decarbonization in a major way, because it's part of our identity. It's what our students and faculty expect of us. And short answer is, yeah, there's a lot of bottom-up activity. Puts people like me in an uncomfortable position sometimes. The whole project that we spent all this time investigating was actually kicked off because of student activism, right? So a handful of years ago, students were feeling that our climate action plan needed to be refreshed. And they had a meeting with the then president of our university, who agreed to fund these studies. So the whole process and project was initiated by student activism. Students were not happy, as there were student activists who were very unhappy with the recommendation to go with option 2B, right? Because they saw it as sort of the option that invested the least money, that committed the least in terms of dollars, that achieved the least emissions. And they would have liked to see us naturally go for the most expensive option, technically expensive, et cetera, that had the most emissions reductions. And so they attended board meetings, they gave testimony, they and in other forums let their displeasure be known, and that pressure continues to this day.
On thinking about the sort of major constraints to the project as we were evaluating the project, budget certainly one of those, and a non-trivial one. But I think importantly, as we looked at the different options, those that would have required a conversion from a steam heat distribution system to laying down new pipes with a hot water-based distribution system, we really would have torn up the campus. And so that I forget how many, is it 4 miles worth of tunnels we would have had to have laid down, roughly equivalent 4 miles worth of new hot water line across the campus. And taken offline several of our major buildings for, sometimes as much as 2 years at a time, relocate all of the users of those buildings to other places on campus, which is a logistical feat in and of itself, while we refit the building so that it could operate off of a hot water system instead of a steam system. And so those logistical hurdles, which it's not just moving a classroom or an office space, but many of those buildings, including some of the older buildings, are our most intensive research facilities. So some of them house, clinical operations, wet labs, operating with significant pieces of equipment that aren't easy to move, aren't easy to reset. And so the disruption to the daily operations of the campus, both on the student class side and on the research infrastructure side, were significant. And during that time, we would likely see significant, again, kind of moving that back to the budget space. But if we can't conduct the research, then the federal government, who is oftentimes the sponsor of that research, is not going to fund it. And similarly, if we can't offer the classes, it becomes pretty difficult for our students. So that logistical hurdle, particularly in older buildings where we'd have to do significant remodel and renovation, was a major friction point for us as we thought through this.
I think there's one more question just come up, and I just pasted in the chatting board. Jung-hee Park asks, are there any other successful cases of energy transition in higher education institutes? So do you know if there are any other successful cases?
There are. So we are on the cutting edge, but we're not the absolute first. Some institutions that we visited, or or that our consultants worked for before they came to us, and who have either implemented systems similar to the one that we contemplated or are in the process. Let's see, they include Stanford University has a really nice hot water system that does much of what our option 3 was contemplating. Princeton University has torn up their campus. So if you want to see an example of a torn up campus, that is a great place to go visit. They're doing all the things that we were contemplating in option 4. They are in the process of implementing them now. There are lots and lots of less well-known universities and community colleges, for that matter, across the United States that are engaging in this. I think it's important to say that most institutions that are doing this work are, they're motivated, of course, for the environmental reasons, but it's almost always the case that that's not enough. What normally pushes them over the hump to make the decision to go for one of these big systems is that their situation coincides with major deferred maintenance, right? They happen to have lots and lots of equipment that needs to be replaced. That is almost always the underlying reason that makes the projects pencil out. Often, as Brian was saying before, like the regional differences can be quite significant. California pays about 5 or 6 times as much for gas and electricity as we do. So their finances are way, way different. But anyways, the main thing that motivates campuses to make this decision are when their existing systems are aging out and need to be replaced anyways. And unfortunately, that wasn't our situation.
Yeah, actually, I would ask one more question because according to your presentation, I saw most of the plan lasted for more than 20 years. Like you are estimating what will happen in 2040s, right? So my question is how to guarantee the delivery of these strategies? Do you have any idea?
This is one of the major issues. I think when you're setting a pro forma that pushes out that far, you're making some pretty significant assumptions. I think there were some concerns about our ability to deliver options 3 and 4 on time. And so that may stretch out even further. How the other piece of that is when you're thinking about a major utility system, that is a 50, 80, 100-year asset. So much of the infrastructure system that we have in place today was built in the 1950s or in the next sort of decade. So that's already 60, 70 years old. We expect much of that will continue to live on unless we were to choose to replace it. And because of the significant capital cost, if you don't think about it in that long time horizon, then you don't fully amortize the benefits associated with it. So that's really difficult. And given the amount of uncertainty in commodity prices, it makes it really hard to make some of these decisions because you have to push out into so far in the future when you have so little certainty.
Yeah, I'll also say that we conducted what we call over here sensitivity analyses, right? So we varied the the utility costs by 10%, by 20%, I think in certain cases, up and down, above and below. Same thing with capital costs and the construction costs, all of that, to see if we were off by even a significant factor, does that have a material impact on the decision? And then the sensitivity analysis essentially came back to say that, yeah, sure, these things can shift around a little bit, but they didn't ultimately affect kind of the brunt of the financial impact.
So I would just make one comment here because I reviewed a biodiversity strategy in London for about 20 years. One of the main strategy to guarantee the delivery was to write all the biodiversity conservation ideas in the London plan, which is a fundamental policy guaranteed by law. So maybe it's similar for energy conservation. Another thing is we use natural capital counting as one way to visualize how the sustainable goals or the cost can be reduced. So I think even though we cannot predict what will happen after 20 years, it's still very useful to help decision makers to see the result or potential result visually nowadays. It's very helpful somehow. That's all my comment. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the engaging discussion. Now we have reached the end of the session, and before concluding the webinar, I would like to thank Steve and Brian, our speakers for today's session, and our panelists for their valuable insight and for engaging the audience to an enlightening discussion. I thank all of our attendees for their active participation. We extend our special thanks to the APRU team for their support and Professor Yonshiko at Korea University for organizing these events and creating a learning and networking platform for everybody. We request you to look forward for our upcoming sessions too. The next session, our last session of the series for this year, will be on December 17th by Professor Iman Harimawan, University Airlangga, Indonesia, on sustainable finance and corporates. Thank you once again, everyone. We hope you have a great day ahead. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.